Thank you all very much. Is that too loud? Are we okay? I feel very loud. It is a real delight to be here with you all today. As Jerry said, I sort of have a tangential and very positive relationship with Loma Linda from friends and mentors like Bob Orr. So also had Bob as well. He and I had a chance to chat about this talk over the course of this week, and that was very, very helpful for me. So it is also really nice to be here in terms of being in a faith-based institution. So to give you a sense of my history and where I come from, so this is a map of the United States, and what it does is it kind of charts out the percentage of people. I thought I sounded a little divine. Okay, there you go. Better. I like that. So this is a map of the United States, and it charts the percentage of people who say they really are not religious at all. And the dark states are the ones that have more people where they say they're not religious at all. As you can see there, oh gosh, sorry, that was the wrong way. There's a lot in the top right, and there's a lot in the top left. And so I lived in Vermont for 15 years, which is number 2 in the country in terms of people who say, I'm not religious at all. And then about a year and a half ago, my family and I, we moved to Oregon, which interestingly enough tops the list as the state that has the least number of people who are religious. So to be back in a faith-based institution and to be able to talk about some really important things through the perspective of faith is a real honor for me. So thank you for that. So we're going to do a few things today. We're going to look at some empirical data. We're also going to look at the values and obligations that affect decisions at the end of life. And we're going to explore some reasons why devout patients make decisions they do. And some of that came as a surprise to me and may potentially also come as a surprise to you. So, a few things about Christian belief that I think are probably transcending any denominational divides. So I'm going to talk very basically about some sort of high-level concepts, and I'm going to try to ground those in Scripture for substantiation. So God promises the faithful eternal life in heaven. A variety of scriptural references for that, John 3:16 among the most famous. So that seems like a core part of our Christian belief. Also, there's a very strong contrast between earthly life and heavenly life. So in the second letter to the Corinthians, Paul writes, "For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed instead with our heavenly dwelling, because when we are clothed, we will not be found naked." And the contrast between our earthly dwelling and our heavenly dwelling is very significant. So, again, in 1 Corinthians, Paul writes, "So will it be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable. It is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body." So in sum, what that means is that we have an eternity in heaven, and so at most we'll live 100 years on earth, probably less than that, but we'll live for eternity in heaven, and not just in terms of duration is there a difference, but in terms of quality. As I think we all know, life is hard for many people. There are burdens, there are challenges, and if we believe what the Scripture says, then life in heaven won't have that, and it will be of an entirely different nature than life on earth. The quantity, I think, is also very important. So if you think about it, our time on earth, no matter how long it might seem, and even if we live to a ripe old age, is still infinitesimally small compared to the eternity in heaven. So based on that, the scriptural sense that we have eternity and bliss in heaven to look forward to, and the challenges of life on earth, I would assume that faithful Christians should be looking forward to being in heaven. So we can sort of ask for a show of hands. Who here is looking forward to being in heaven one day? Well, that didn't take you guys any time at all. I agree, that makes perfect sense. In fact, we might be so looking forward to it that we might be so excited that we can't even wait to get there. We're like, I can't wait to get there, right? And we might even be tempted to say, hey, it's going to be great when it comes. This is not looking so good for me sometimes here, so maybe we can move things along a little bit. So maybe we'll be tempted to sort of move things along a little bit. Or there are some things maybe we're not going to be tempted to do. No matter how much we want to get to heaven, we're not willing to go through that in order to get there. But regardless of whether we want to move things along, we probably are being cognizant of the fact that we'd be watching for our exit ramp, whenever that might come. And sometimes the exit ramp is right in front of us. And if, I would imagine, if what our current life is full of burden, without much of a future, then we would be very eager to get to the next stage and walk through the pearly gates. So my beginning argument is, given that eternal bliss awaits, faithful Christians should look forward to heaven. So far, so good? Does that make sense to everybody? Like, point one is okay? All right. The other thing I should point out is this. That was on a few of the slides. So that is a web address, and if anybody wants to download the entire presentation, it's right there. So help yourself, tinyurl.com/devout requests. Okay. Moving on from that to point number 2. Faith impacts medical decisions. The majority of Americans, when surveyed, say that faith would impact, whatever faith they have, impacts their decisions in the medical realm. In fact, cancer patients, in some studies, at least lung cancer patients, say that next to the oncologist's recommendations, the second most important thing for them in making medical decisions is their faith. So this faith that we were talking about, this framing of our current life on earth and our looking forward to eternity in heaven, frames the decisions that we make in a medical context, especially the really serious decisions we make in a medical context when we are faced with a life-threatening diagnosis. And that's been shown across all kinds of surveys. This is one that I oftentimes return to. This is a very famous one that Karen Steinhauser did, published in JAMA in 2000, and it basically asked physicians and patients in a VA context, what's most important for you as you reach the end of your life? And what they found was the number one thing was freedom from pain among patients and also among physicians. But the number two thing for both patients and bereaved family members was being at peace with God at the end. And this is not a surprise to you because I think Loma Linda does an amazing job of blending the science of technology and of medicine and also the faith and values of human beings in a faith-based context. So we've seen how important it is in making decisions. There are also data to support that spiritual care improves quality of life in the context of significant illness. So this is a study, which we're going to come back to, a variety of the Balboni studies, that shows that spiritual support improves quality of life. So this is predictors of quality of life. This is among patients who are seriously ill. And spiritual support on multivariate analysis has a huge impact for those who are receiving spiritual support and those who aren't. Now that might not come as a surprise to you guys. The form of spiritual support that is most effective might, and what happens with spiritual support that isn't the preferred form and the effect of that probably will come as a surprise if you're like me, because it surprised me as well. Okay, point number 2. Faith impacts medical decision-making. Am we good with that? Does that make sense to everybody? Kind of figured so. Okay, now we're going to get to the surprising parts. So I would think, based on those two things that we talked about this notion of looking forward to heaven and faith impacting medical decision-making, that if you're a devout person, you've sought divine guidance in your life, you've asked forgiveness for your sins, you trust God to take care of you, and you accept the fact that you're terminally ill. Doctors have said your earthly life is going to be coming to an end, that you would probably opt for a treatment plan that focuses on relieving pain and discomfort as much as possible, even if that means that you might not happen to live as long on earth, because your life is not going to end, your earthly life is going to stop, and your heavenly life is going to begin. Let eternity come. So that's what I would think. And I would be wrong. So let me try to prove that to you before I start saying that's just wrong. So this is a study we're going to look at in some detail. This was the first really big study that showed this, and it's been duplicated many times, and also I'll show you some other studies that verify it. This came out in 2009 in JAMA, Religious Coping and the Use of Intensive Life-Prolonging Care Near Death in Patients with Advanced Cancer. And their conclusion was, positive religious coping in patients with advanced cancer is associated with receipt of intensive life-prolonging medical care near death. In other words, people who espouse more religious coping, that they look at the world through more religious eyes, are more likely to receive aggressive treatment at the end of their lives, even though they've been told they're terminally ill. That surprised me. So, a little bit of a personal anecdote and a little bit of sort of, there's an old saying that good judgment comes from experience and experience comes from bad judgment. And so I don't mean to say this is bad judgment, but when Dr. Winslow asked me to give this talk about 9 months ago, he said, so can you give me a title? And at that point, I had no idea what I was going to talk about. And I knew about this study that I'm going to talk to you guys about. And I'm like, that sounds interesting. And so I came up with this catchy title, and all of a sudden it starts getting finalized, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I really have to figure out what I think about this now. So now we're going to sort of delve in and try to figure out what we all think about this. Okay, so who is this study about? This is a subset of the Coping with Cancer study. These are patients with advanced cancer from multiple sites, both in the Northeast and also in the South. And as you can see, there are certain inclusion criteria. Adults who have an unpaid caregiver, some family member or friend, who have advanced cancer and a limited life expectancy. So this is the big chart of who they are. And the important thing to note is that what they did was, these are the patients who are high religious copers in terms of positive coping. We'll talk about that in a sec. These are low religious copers. And they took pretty much a matched set. So they have about equal numbers of each. And as you can see, in terms of their religious belief, almost all of them are Christian. So Catholic, Protestant, Baptist. I always thought that Baptists were Protestants, but evidently they're breaking this up a little bit, so I'm not sure why. All that means is that you're sort of taking a equal subset of high religious copers and low religious copers, and you're trying to figure out how they view the world and what they do in terms of their treatment plan. So what does it mean to be a religious coper? There's this thing called the RCOPE, and it's a validated scale of 14 measures that are broken down into positive religious coping and negative religious coping. And so this is about looking at the world through a religious lens. So positive things are things like you seek God's love and care. You seek help from God in letting go of anger. You try to put your plans into action together with God. So it's a way of coping with the world in a positive way based on your faith-based perspective. There's also negative aspects of it. You know, has God abandoned me? Do you feel punished? Do you question God's love? And what they decided to do is only look at positive religious coping. So we're not looking at people who look at the world through religious eyes. We're looking at people who look at the world through religious eyes and use it positively to cope based on these sort of aspects. So what they find. So this is the level of positive religious coping and end-of-life care. And then what they broke it down was the level of positive religious coping was either high or low. And what they found was that in all these areas, mechanical ventilation, resuscitation, invasive life-prolonging care, and death in the ICU, you were much more likely to have those if you were a high-level positive religious coper. So the more that you coped with life through a positive religious lens, the more likely you were to get all this aggressive treatment at the end of the life that your doctors told you was coming to an end. Does anybody have any theories about why that might be? Yes, sir?
Subconsciously, they don't really believe their Christian beliefs.
Subconsciously, so we're going to get to that. That's kind of hitting straight at, like, is this a crisis of faith? From a methodological standpoint, can anybody think of any confounding variables that we should be worried about? Because what we're seeing is that people who are more religious tend to get more aggressive treatment. Is there any other variable in there that might actually be explaining the I want more treatment that isn't actually based on religion? Yes, sir. So it could be family and environment. That's a tough one to measure. Anything else? Yes, sir. Expecting a miracle. So that's an example of a rationale, certainly. Yes, sir. Unresolved guilt and not feeling ready. You guys are thinking exactly the way I'm thinking. So, one more. Yes, sir, Jim.
Greater hope and faith.
Jargon. Maybe it's extrinsic religion as opposed to internal religion.
Okay, so that's a great point. Did you have a question I'm going to come back to you? So it could be extrinsic religiosity. So extrinsic religiosity is things like, I'm going to church, but I may have other reasons for going to church other than spiritual reasons. The RCOPE actually tries to get more into an internal religiosity mode, so they're trying to accommodate for that. Sir, did you have a question or a comment? Higher hope. We're going to talk about that as well. And one more, and then we should move on. Dr. Bull.
Statistically, the only groups that are significant are hospice care enrollment, and they're identical. Otherwise, your p-values are borderline significant.
Okay, so hospice enrollment, so, no.
Hospice enrollment, 127 to 122, at which point they have abandoned all unusual care.
So the hospice care enrollment is the one, if I understand this correctly, where the p-value is non-significant, whereas the others are significant p-values, so there's a significant difference between high and low religious copers.
They're significant, but that's very borderline. And your big numbers are in the hospice care choice.
Okay, so the point that last one, I love this, go for it.
Maybe there's a religious belief that you can't stop the G-tube or something like that.
You can't stop the what?
G-tube or...
You can't stop the G-tube? Is that a religious belief? It could be. But I think your point is a really good one, which is, are there certain things that we feel like we have to accept? The thing that I was going for in a confounder was actually race. So let me explain why. So if you look at it, this is the race and ethnicity of the various groups. As you can see, white patients, in terms of, remember this is a matched cohort, so in terms of the number of people who are high religious copers, low religious copers outnumbered high in the white cohort by about 2 to 1. So far more white patients or white subjects were low religious copers. On the other hand, in terms of black and Hispanic, far more black and Hispanic patients were high religious copers than they were low religious copers. So maybe it's not really a religion thing. Maybe it's a race ethnicity thing that religion is masking. So maybe it's not the fact that you are religious that's causing you to request all this. Maybe it's the fact that you're black or Hispanic. Because there is good data out there to support that especially African American patients are more likely to request aggressive treatment at the end of life for all kinds of potentially non-religious reasons. Yes, ma'am.
They don't start. And I think with Oregon was considering putting the end of life, excuse me. I think racial minorities, especially black women, are the least trustful of the system, and so we're more likely to oppose the law.
In terms of death with dignity or
Yeah,
physician aid in
right.
dying? Absolutely. So there's good data to support that. So they thought about that. Like, hopefully good investigators think about this. So what they did is they broke it down. We saw this a second ago. So they broke it down and they did a multivariate analysis to try to remove the potential confounder of race and ethnicity. And this is what they found. This is the unadjusted odds ratio and p-value, and this is the adjusted odds ratio. And what they found was that mechanical ventilation and ICU care remain significant, even when you remove race and ethnicity as a potential confounding variable, which prompts a really fascinating conclusion. And we shouldn't get too bogged down by it. I have a lot more conclusions, so we can't get too slow here. But the conclusion they found was that it's actually not race or ethnicity primarily driving aggressive care, but rather the role of religious values. So maybe there is confounding, but it works in the opposite direction. It's not so much us thinking falsely that it's religion, but it's actually race ethnicity, but rather it's, for a long time we thought it's race ethnicity, maybe it's actually religion, and the fact that certain racial and ethnic groups are more likely to espouse religious coping. So we can talk more about that as we go along. All right, so the summary of this study is that high religious copers compared to low religious copers, the odds ratio of preferring heroic measures at the end of life in a terminal context, high religious copers, odds ratio-wise, were 6 times more likely to request aggressive treatment than low religious copers. They were also 3 times more likely to receive intensive treatment, like cardiopulmonary resuscitation, and 2 times more likely to receive intensive care, was the outcome of this study. Now, you might think, well, that's just one study. There's a lot of other ones, too. So these are studies that found the exact same thing, and there are others that have followed. In terms of how we measure and the questions we ask, and at least using the RCOPE scale, this to me is a duplicated and verified study. And I'm going to use that as sort of a baseline. So we can talk methodologically about that, but I think there's good data to support the claim that high religious copers are more likely to request aggressive treatment at the end of life, and I'd like to spend our time thinking about why that is and how we can respond to that. So, step 3, devout terminally ill patients, including faithful Christians, remember that was primarily a Christian cohort, are more likely to request aggressive treatment in an attempt to prolong earthly life. So, why is this important? Pain and suffering happen frequently at the end of life, especially when you go through aggressive treatment. And studies have shown that aggressive end-of-life care, specifically in cancer, is associated with a poorer quality of death and caregiver bereavement. So, like, it's a big deal. People at the very end of their lives are going through a lot of stuff that is very high burden. And we're not sure at this point why, although we've come up with some great ideas. If doing the right thing, otherwise known as minimizing suffering, is enough, there's a huge financial impact. So, costs are higher for patients whose spiritual needs aren't supported in terms of their last weeks of life, especially for minorities, especially for high religious copers. In fact, there's been, on broad-based analysis, if we provided adequate spiritual support to patients in order to hopefully help them see that this is not any kind of religious obligation or frame this question in more spiritually and medically informed terms, the national savings would be about $1.2 billion a year in terms of healthcare costs. Now, I don't mean to say that's why we should do it. You know, we're not all about saving money, but it's important to think about. Were you going to say something? Okay. So, given that eternal bliss awaits, faithful Christians should look forward to heaven. Faith impacts medical decision-making. Devout terminally ill patients, including faithful Christians, are more likely to request aggressive treatment in an attempt to prolong earthly life. Why? We've already come up with some reasons. Let me kind of flesh out that with some data, and then we can have some great time for conversation. So Balboni and Balboni are a really interesting pair. They're a married couple in Boston. One's a radiation oncologist, one is a pastor. And they've done a lot of this work. And they have a really wonderful book that just came out this year called Hostility to Hospitality, looking at spiritual care and the practice of medicine. And they came up with 4 different ideas, some of which have already been mentioned here, for why this might be. So religious community spiritual support leading to end-of-life outcomes, low quality of life, increased pain, ICU death, and they came up with 4. And we'll go through each of these. Divine sovereignty, miracles, sacredness of life, and suffering as a test from God. So divine sovereignty will be the first one. So only God knows when it's your time to die. You know, when you go back to whether it's Ecclesiastes or other scriptural references, it's very clear that God has control of our lives in terms of our whole world and also us as individuals. And that's a belief that's clearly held by a great many Christians, especially in the African American community. Nearly a third of U.S. clergy said that they'd be sympathetic to patients who say, I'm not sure what to do, I'm just going to keep going because it's up to God when I die. And also, if physicians are seen as tools of God, that may also lead to an increased tendency to take the physician's recommendation, to say, well, if you are acting as sort of God's hand in my life, then if you recommend I do this, then I should do it. So divine sovereignty is one. Another is miracles. We talked about this already. Somebody mentioned it. So there could be a hope for miracle. Now remember, the Coping with Cancer study was about patients. Their inclusion criteria is being told by their doctor that they have less than a year to live. And I'd be very curious what the question was to the patients. Like, was the question, do you think you have less than a year to live? Or was it, did your doctor tell you that you have less than a year to live? Because sometimes what your doctor tells you is it's a natural phenomenon. Maybe you're anticipating a supernatural intervention. So even though you have a certain diagnosis, you may be looking for a miraculous healing. Studies have shown that a lot of patients, the majority in some studies, say that they either hope for or expect a miracle to occur. Certainly the case in the Coping with Cancer study. And so it's a way that some patients have tried to maintain control of their lives, to say, I can't control my physical disease process, but I can control part of it by prayer and trying to hope that God will heal me. And that may also lead to a decreased likelihood of enrollment in hospice, because hospice saying, yes, I recognize I'm in the last 6 months of life, might be viewed as a concession to say a miracle is not going to occur. But if I keep going, that's my way of saying I'm still trusting in God to perform a miracle. A third is the sacredness of life. There's a Dan Solmese, who's was a Catholic friar, also a bioethicist and physician, wrote a great article some years ago where he quoted various patients he's worked saying that they didn't want to give up on God before God's given up on me. And so there's a sense of this life is sacred. It's a gift. It's potentially the greatest gift God has ever given me, and I need to use it in the best possible way that I can. And we're going to come back more to that concept later. If you believe that, then doing anything, whether it's hospice enrollment or agreeing to things like a DNAR, do not assent resuscitation order, could be viewed as not honoring the gift that God has given us. And so trying to figure out what we do with that notion of honoring life and making thoughtful decisions in light of that is going to be important. Okay, so I've been blathering around with slides. So I was going to tell you a story. One of the most memorable cases I've ever been involved in happened when I was at the University of Vermont. And there was a woman in her 40s who I never had a chance to talk to because by the time I got involved in her care, she had had a massive stroke. And she seemed, from the stories that I heard from her family, to be an absolutely remarkable woman. She had had some tough times in her early years. She had come to faith later on in her life. And she had decided that her faith was calling her to serve God in the medical field. So she was in her 40s and she was going back to nursing school in order to ideally become a missionary and use her nursing skills in an international context. And so, her dreams were coming true. She was part of a very faithful, very active congregation over the Lake Champlain in New York State. And it just felt like things were going really good for her. Then she suffered this massive stroke. And the prognosis for any kind of cognitive recovery was incredibly poor. And so her family, at first she was on a ventilator, and then she had a G-tube placed, and we were continuing to provide artificial nutrition and hydration. She eventually weaned from the ventilator, and it became clear over the coming days and weeks that she was not going to have a neurologic recovery, that she was going to be essentially in a vegetative state. And her family, through lots of conversations, said, this isn't the life that she wanted. And this isn't the life that she thought God had given her. The life that God had given her, she was going to use in a certain way. And she was dedicated to that. And she was at peace. And since all this stuff happened, I think we should let her go back to God. And so the decision was made to stop the artificial nutrition and hydration, focus on comfort, and let her die. We were an acute care hospital. It's not the kind of thing that we do over a long period of time. And so the plan was, her faith community's in New York State, across the lake. Her family's back there. So we decided we would transfer her back to a nursing home in New York State in order to provide end-of-life care with hospice support. So we sent her back. And then the faith community heard what was going on and said, we won't stand for this. And so there were reports of nursing staff at the nursing home surreptitiously infusing water into her G-tube at night in order to prevent dehydration from occurring because they didn't think it was right. And the pastor of her church demanded a meeting with the hospital board and said, you either start providing nutrition and hydration to her or I'm going to the press and we're going to do Terry Schiavo all over again. And I had gotten to know this family, and mostly her sister and her mom, and they were grieving the loss of their sister and daughter. And the thought of this being plastered over the headlines and causing that degree of suffering for them was just awful to think about. So there aren't too many emergency ethics consults. This was one. So when we heard about this, I got in my car, hopped on the ferry, drove across the lake, and we had this big meeting with the pastor and a couple of members of his congregation, along with the whole ethics committee from the hospital that was sort of overseeing her care in the nursing home. And so I went through a lot of the stuff that we're talking about today. I talked about what it means from a scriptural perspective about life being a gift, but I also talked about how God wants us to have life and have it abundantly, and talked about how we anticipate eternity in heaven. We talked about her faith. We talked about what God called her to do. And nothing seemed to resonate. And then at the very end, I told them a story, which is the story I'm going to tell you. So you guys may remember the joke. There's a joke out there about a flood. this is a guy on a roof, but there's other ones. We're going to take the guy on the roof. So there's a guy on a roof in a flood, and he prays to God. He's like, God, don't let me drown. And so a boat comes by and says, hey, you're trapped on the roof. Can we give you a ride? He's like, it's okay. I'm waiting on God. I'm praying. I'm good. So he refuses the boat. Then a helicopter comes by and says, hey, we'll lower a line. We'll take you out of here. And he's like, I'm good. God's on my side. And then a raft comes by, and the guy's paddling along. He's like, hey, the waters are rising. I can give you a lift. I got room in my raft. He's like, that's all right. I have faith. I'm praying to God. And the raft goes on. The waters rise, and the man drowns. And then fast forward to standing before the pearly gates in heaven. And God says, welcome my faithful child to heaven. And the guy's like, oh, hold on a minute here. Well, I was praying to you for so long on that roof, and I drowned. What the heck am I doing here? And God says, well, what do you think the boat, the helicopter, and the raft were about? Who do you think sent them? And so I kind of took that story, I told it, and I sort of turned it on its ear. And I said, what if we looked at it from the other perspective? Not someone praying to God, please save me, and God sending all these things to save them. But what if someone is praying to God, God, please take me home. I know where I'll be forever, and I trust you, and I want to rest in your arms. And every time we come by and say, well, we know we're going to do the ventilator, and that keeps them here. And we're going to do tube feeds, and we're going to keep them here. Maybe everything that we're doing that we think is in service to God's will is actually preventing God's will from happening. And the meeting ended soon thereafter, and the pastor and his advisors took a few minutes and then came back 20 or 30 minutes later and said, we don't like this plan. But if this is the way it's going to be, this is the way it's going to be, and we're going to support her in prayer as she dies. And the thing that I'll always remember about that was that it was a purely theological, faith-based discussion. And I think that those of you who work in the clinical realm will know that sometimes when we talk about faith and medicine, we don't really talk about them together, we talk about them in parallel. There's the medical discussion, and there's the faith discussion, and never the two shall meet. And unless we figure out a way to get the two to meet and infuse one with the other, then we're ending up going to just be talking past each other. Okay, the last of the Balboni references, before I get on to a couple of extra for me. Suffering as a test or blessing. I think there's a very fine line between trying to find some meaning in suffering, a noble task, and saying suffering is good, we should embrace it. Like granted, there are lots of scriptural texts, we won't have time to go into all these, about suffering for the sake of the church, about suffering for the sake of others, and suffering for the sake of oneself. But it's very dangerous, I think, for us to say that suffering in and of itself is a good thing, absent context. All right, so those are the 4 Balboni things. I'm going to add a couple more of my own and spend a little time on the second one. One is earthly obligations. Maybe I don't think my work on earth is done. I know that heaven is coming. I know I've got eternity there, but I have eternity there and I don't have eternity here, that means time is short. And maybe I have other things I have left to do. And I don't mean self-serving things. Maybe I have people to care about. In the letter to the Philippians, the author says, I'm torn between the two. I desire to depart to be with Christ, that eternity in heaven, which is better by far, but it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body. So maybe we have people we care about who still need us, that we're not willing to forsake. And so there have also been studies that show that religiousness and spiritual support may help in preserving meaning and help you be connected to a community more longer than those who feel isolated at the end of their lives. And that community connection may be something you want to continue to foster and nurture. All right, last one for me, which is sort of the title of the talk. I called it metaphysical concerns. We could also call it doubt. What if you get to the end, or what looks like the end, and you say, I understand what Scripture says. I understand what the doctrine of my faith is. I understand that heaven is supposed to be coming. and I should be looking forward to it, but I'm scared. You know, it's always interesting to me when we talk about, are you sure? You know, I'll say to somebody, like, are you sure you did that? Are you sure we got that covered? I say that to my kids all the time. You sure you locked the door? And they're like, oh, yeah. And then I was like, would you bet your allowance that you locked the door? They're like, well, I'm not that sure. You know, and then they go back and do it. The stakes are a lot higher now, right? What you thought when you were healthy, I'm sure, at the very end, when it's like, okay, here we go, do or die, you might say, I'm really sure, pretty sure. So what does that do for you? Especially when you figure out the other stuff that we've been talking about. That sense of potential doubt, however big it is. Maybe part of it's not sufficiently respecting divine sovereignty. Like, I think I'm sure, I'm pretty sure, but if I say no to that treatment that could be alive, maybe I'm not sufficiently respecting divine sovereignty. Maybe I'm not trusting in a miracle if I say yes to hospice. Maybe that's a bad sign of what I'm doing. Maybe I haven't suffered enough if that whole redemptive suffering thing is true. Maybe I just need to kind of keep going a little while longer. Maybe I haven't done as much as I was supposed to do. And this is where sometimes the effect of negative religious coping comes in. So we talked a lot about positive religious coping. That's how you got into the coping with cancer study. There's also these things about negative religious coping. Has God abandoned me? Am I still loved? Have I done something that's so wrong that even God can't forgive me? And so this is from the Phelps study, what they looked at. So this is about how many people do negative religious coping. As you can see, people who do low level of positive religious coping, so people who don't do any positive religious coping don't do a whole lot of negative either. But people who do high positive religious coping, the majority of them do negative religious coping too. Like, the bad comes with the good. Like, if you're going to look at the world through religious terms, sometimes it's comforting, and sometimes it's not. And so that's an important thing to take into account for the faithful as well. And so this led me to think about the parable of the talents. So probably familiar with it, just to review. Rich guy says to his servants, I'm going away for a while. I'm going to entrust you guys with this stuff. A talent is a whole lot of money, not an ability. And so he said to one, here's 5. Said to another, here's 2. Said to another, here's 1. And I want you to do good stuff with it while I'm gone. And I'm going to come back. And he came back, and the guy with 5 said, hey, I got you 5 more. And the rich dude was like, that's awesome. Way to go. Proud of you. And the guy with 2 said, I doubled mine too. You only gave me 2, but I got you 2 more. And the rich guy said, good job. Way to go. And they came down to the guy with 1. And he said, I was afraid. I know that you are stern. You're a stern taskmaster, and your expectations are high. And I was afraid I'd lose it, and you'd be really angry. And because I was afraid, I buried it. Because that way, at least I could tell you I didn't lose it. So here it is, it's back. So most of us are familiar with the parable of talents. You know how the story ends. But for me, if I had never heard that story, based on my vision of God, I would want God to be like, you didn't have to be afraid. I'd forgive you if you tried your best and you failed. And I'd like God to wrap that person up in a hug and say, we're going to do this again one day. Let's not do this the same way, because now you know that I love you no matter what you do. That's what I'd like the parable to say. The Bible doesn't say it that way, does it? So how does it say it in the Bible? To the third servant, the rich guy says, you wicked and slothful servant. So much for the hug, right? To everyone who has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. I'm an ethicist. That doesn't sound great to me, you know? And I'm going to cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And sometimes I wonder, at the very end of one's life, a very faithful life, when you see the end coming and you know what the teachings of the church are and what your faith says, if maybe there's a little bit inside of people that says, did I do enough? Did I double what I was given? Or did I come up short sometimes? Was I scared sometimes, like I am now? And what's going to happen when whatever talents I have left, I hand them to the rich landowner and say, this is what I did? How is that person representing God going to respond? So what should we do? Well, we could provide more spiritual care. That seems like a good idea. These are spiritual issues, but not so fast. This is also very interesting. It depends on who's providing it. So patients who are well supported by the religious community they came from were over twice as likely to receive aggressive measures in the last week of life, 6 times more likely to die in the ICU, and it's even worse with people who are high religious copers. If you're a high religious coper, you really look at the world in religious terms, and you have a solid religious community that you come from, your chance of aggressive treatment or ending up in the ICU is order of magnitude more. That didn't make sense, did it? All of a sudden we're like, it's a spiritual issue, let's get some spiritual help, and all of a sudden we made it worse. And you can see, this is graphically depicting, the dark bars are high spiritual support from their religious community, the light bar is low spiritual support. So for aggressive treatment, people with high spiritual support, much more likely to get it. Death in ICU, high spiritual support, much more likely to get it. What's going on there? This is table form, which you can review if you want. So why is that? A couple of ideas. Clergy could overestimate the chance for cure. So maybe they say, well, it's not that bad, or let's keep hoping. Clergy may be unfamiliar with signs of advancing illness. They may not understand the medical world. So some folks decided to test that. They gave clergy a test about knowledge and desire for training in end-of-life care and asked them a bunch of questions. Turns out clergy think that hospice care, they misunderstand hospice care. They don't really understand palliative care. They think that CPR is way more likely to work than it actually is. And they're also fearing addiction way more than they probably should be in a cancer population. Is that their fault? No. Like, if you don't teach somebody something, how are they supposed to know it? And so, beyond that, it also led to a passive approach to end-of-life care. So, this is from a study from a couple of years ago of local clergy. Clergy were ambivalent about and adopted a passive approach to counseling their congregants about decision-making, despite having defined beliefs regarding end-of-life care. Like if you ask clergy, what's a good death? They'll tell you. Lower pain, sense of belonging, surrounded by loved ones, being at peace with God. They'll tell you what a good death is. But when a congregant comes to them and says, I need some guidance getting there, they're like, okay, it's up to you, really. I don't want to get in your way. They embrace the role of supporting, not questioning a seriously ill patient's decision to pursue aggressive or comfort-focused care. And so this is really interesting from a theological point of view. Different study, same idea. Clergy identified 4 things that were important to a good death, and if you didn't have them, were part of a bad death. Dignity, preparedness, physical suffering, and community. Those are good things, right? I think we'd all agree on that. Physical suffering is an interesting one from the theological point, which we can talk more about if we want. But the most interesting one that I thought about was dignity. Dignity is a good thing. But dignity can mean a lot of different things. To my mind, when I hear the word dignity in a theological context, I think of the image of God within us, that we have dignity because we are children of God, and we bear the mark of God within us. And so recognizing that, honoring the dignity of a patient, I think is saying, you are beloved of God. You are God's child, and one day you will return to God. What does that mean about the decisions we make? Interestingly enough, when they asked the clergy, what exactly do you mean when you say dignity? They weren't talking about the imago Dei. They were talking about individual human autonomy. Like, don't get me wrong, I've read Beecham and Childress. I know the 4 principles of biomedical ethics. Autonomy is great. Autonomy is not the most biblical term in the whole wide world. So this is an interesting thing. about how clergy are engaging. They're engaging in a way that basically says, I think I know what a good death is. I have a scriptural basis for that. But somehow what the patient wants is what the patient gets. And might be too strong a word, but the word abdication comes to mind in terms of pastoral responsibility. So what does this mean in terms of, how do we put this all together? We've already said that a religious community improves quality of life overall, but that same religious community actually decreases or risks decreasing quality of life at the end of life. How does that work? Balboni et al. Say that this contrasting finding may reflect religious communities' focus on spiritual support in fighting disease, a form of support that may uphold quality of life earlier in the course of advanced illness. Stay involved in our community. Be part of this. Don't lose your connections. Despite the fact that you're suffering, despite the fact that you have advanced illness, doesn't mean that you're any less a person. You're still a part of us. All great stuff. But this may become increasingly incongruent or even in conflict with patients' spiritual needs as death becomes imminent. So that's great at the beginning, and maybe the middle. But at the end, maybe we need it to have a different frame. I'm going to skip over that just because we can get a little closer. So we talked about how spiritual care from the spiritual community actually makes the difference even greater in terms of the increased likelihood of aggressive treatment at the end of life. Interestingly enough, studies have shown that spiritual needs that are largely or completely supported by the medical team goes the opposite direction. It makes it less likely that someone will die in the ICU. It makes it less likely that a terminally ill cancer patient will undergo CPR. It makes it more likely that the cancer patient will enroll in hospice. These findings suggest that a possible intervention among patients receiving high religious community spiritual support is the medical team's provision of spiritual support and end-of-life discussions in order to reduce aggressive care. So I'm not saying we shouldn't provide spiritual care. I'm saying we need to provide informed spiritual care. But one problem with that is availability. A lot of places don't prioritize hospital chaplaincy. And patients, when you ask them how much support did you get from a spiritual perspective when you're in the hospital, they tend to say not a whole lot. So in other words, spiritual folks, this is a huge generalization, please don't take this as the take-home message of my talk. In other words, spiritual folks don't know much about medicine, and medical folks don't spend much time on spirituality. So I think there are a couple of things we could do for that. One is we could expand medical chaplaincy services. It's almost like a relay race. The medical chaplain is the anchor leg of your 4x400, and the local clergy take the first 3 legs and then they pass off the baton to someone who knows about the medical stuff. I'm not a huge fan of that plan. Hospital chaplains do a great job, but you start from scratch. What about the community that person came from? What about the relationships that are important for them? What about the journeys that you've already walked together with that person that the faith community has that the chaplain doesn't? Or we could try to equip clergy to provide real good spiritual care at the end of life. And spiritual care, not just in a passive sense, not just in a, I'm visiting you, tell me what you've decided, okay, but an engaging spiritual care at the end of life. So I'm going to blast through sort of some ideas for responses, and then hopefully we can turn it over to everyone to get involved in the conversation. So these are the 6 things that I talked about reasons why, for explaining this phenomenon of aggressive treatment at the end of life for the devout. And we can take them one by one. Divine sovereignty. Is it possible that seeking aggressive treatment is not so much making it possible for God to do what God's doing, but rather trying to maintain control of our lives? Faith in miracles. There's an old saying, God answers every prayer, but sometimes the answer is no. And, in my experience, sometimes a miracle conversation reveals what I sometimes call a transactional type of faith. I believe in God, God does miracle. It's not the most scriptural approach to that topic, I don't think. So how can we help people understand that? Redemptive suffering, which is time, we'd have to spend hours on that one, but all that to say is it's a different model. So this is from that study of clergy that we talked about. If we're seeking life, seeking miraculous healing, willing to undergo redemptive suffering, that leads to a plan of let's keep going with the life-prolonging treatment in the context of terminal illness. If, however, we accept the fact that we're going to die, we bow to God's will, we acknowledge the importance of relief from suffering, that might lead to something else. Sacredness of life. Life is a great gift. But is it possible that all the stuff that we do to prioritize our earthly existence, potentially beyond, out of proportion to anything else, is actually preventing God from bringing us home? Is God sending us helicopters and rafts and boats and saying, that flood's coming up. I don't want you to drown. I want to take you up with me right now. And you say, I'm sorry, no, I'm waiting on a miracle, so I hope those flood waters recede. Earthly obligations. If we really trust in God, like I love my kids to an indescribable amount. And I try everything I know to take care of them. At some point in my life, I'm going to have to turn that job over to God, and ideally, I should have already done that. And lastly, metaphysical concerns. I think the pastoral message, whether it comes from a local congregation or whether it comes from hospital chaplaincy, is not how much have you done? You know, have you multiplied your 2 talents into 4, 5 into 10? I hope it's not just stay in the 1. It shouldn't be that. It shouldn't be how much can you endure? Jesus suffered, you should too. It should be who do you trust? Where is your treasure? Instead of deferring to what is often, from a patient perspective, often misinformed human autonomy, spiritual guides, spiritual counselors should engage in what is a good death? And not just ask the patient, what do you think? But to say, this is scripturally what a good death looks like. This is what God wants for you. How can we factor that into the decisions you make? And lastly, because I think in stories a lot, maybe we can trade in the parable of the talents for the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, which I think has a whole lot more bearing on end-of-life care. So rather than saying, how much have you multiplied the stuff I gave you? And rather than, as the Pharisee said in the second parable, look at all the great stuff I did. I tithed, I go to church, I'm a good guy, I'm faithful to my spouse. Maybe we look at what the tax collector said. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Shouldn't that be what we're equipping patients to do at the end of their lives, rather than seeking aggressive treatment that's unlikely to benefit them? If they're going to put their spiritual affairs in order and be ready for what comes next, which we all hope for. Thankfully, that's my last slide, because that's a lot of slides. Thank you very much.
I'm going to invite our 3 panelists up. And Dr. Macauley, why don't you join them right here? They're going to tell you what they thought of what you just said. And they'll do it in a friendly way. Let me introduce them. And then you get a chance to say back. And then if there's time, we'll have some response from the rest of you. Our first panelist, over on the far right, I think, maybe not, no, almost there, is Dr. Carla Gober-Park. Carla is the Assistant Vice President for Spiritual Life and Mission, and she's also an Associate Professor of Religion here at Loma Linda. She's also the Director of the Center for Spiritual Life and Wholeness, which many of you remember was founded years ago by the beloved Will Alexander. Next to Carlo is Mark Ishikawa. He's the Executive Director in our Marketing Department here at Loma Linda. He recruits students for the School of Religion. He's also educated as a minister, and he has a very special story to offer in regard to what we've just talked about. Next is Dr. Zane Yi, Associate Professor of Religion, educated in theology and philosophy, teaches medical students and other health sciences professionals here at Loma Linda University. And I think we'll just do it in that order as we read. We'll start with Carla and come right down the line here, and then Dr. Macauley will give you a chance to say what they got right.
All right.
I want to say first, thank you, Dr. Macauley, for your presentation. From hearing from you now to reading about you on your websites, it's more than apparent that you live ethically in both your personal and professional life. After all, how many professionals identify cooking with their center rather than their middle daughter, and mention reading with the youngest? That is on a professional website. It is a personal pleasure to respond to you today. And I would say to those of you who might not know this, the role of a responder is to actually raise questions that will help a discussion. So I have to say first that I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation and agree, but I'm going to do my best to raise some questions. Recent research has suggested that going to church enhances health. Any statement or conclusion as broad as this warrants close scrutiny. Ever since the BYRD, that's B-Y-R-D, study years ago, I think it was in the 1980s, that incorrectly identified prayer as a deciding factor for cardiac conditions, researchers have been concerned about how we could best study religion in relation to health outcomes. Would we go so far as to measure which god or gods are the most powerful? And yet, the research was suggesting that religion matters. But what kind of religion? Beliefs and practices associated with religion, religious communities associated with religion, and even theological stances in relation to religion. They all matter in relation to health outcomes. Within this context, I give a response to your presentation. Your first fundamental argument suggests that given that eternal bliss awaits, faithful Christians should look forward to heaven. And you all did, in fact, raise your hands. There are several challenges in this argument. First, Christians disagree on what eternal bliss is or what it will entail. From playing a harp in a monochrome universe to hanging out in some theoretical or physical waiting area before one enters, from identifying one's own group as the only primary group entering, to believing that eventually everyone will enter, from believing one's body to be left behind with only a soul to experience it, if in fact a soul can experience at all, to the belief that physical bodies will inhabit it, there is no unified understanding of what this eternal bliss will be. Thus, feelings and thoughts surrounding it vary immensely, with the outcome that not all could or perhaps even should look forward to it, given their varying ideas of what it is. The second challenge is with the phrase faithful Christians. What is a faithful Christian? Does every Christian know whether he or she is faithful? And if she does, is she willing to label it as such? Is there comfort in doing so? I suspect that there are some, many in fact, who are not sure if they are faithful. What then? Do they still look forward to heaven? Finally, there is the challenge with the word heaven. Christian beliefs vary on what it is, when it starts, how long it lasts, or even if it exists at all, even within the Christian community. For example, if heaven has already begun, such as the kingdom is within you, then eternal bliss does not await at all, but in fact has already begun. Your second fundamental argument suggests that faith impacts medical decision-making. Here I would ask, what kind of faith? And you did a wonderful job, I would say, in unpacking that. As Jim suggested, the intrinsic and extrinsic issue would surely affect decision-making, as does the RCOPE, whether it's negative or positive. And then I say I really appreciate that. Some would say that this means do nothing but pray or follow advice, religious advice, while others would say that this means to see oneself as a primary actor, all of which you covered. The third fundamental argument is quite interesting. Devout, terminally ill patients, including faithful Christians, are more likely to request aggressive treatment that prolongs earthly life. This is the one that I think specifically a Seventh-day Adventist response would be interesting. And with that, I want to tell a short story at the close of this. I worked for 30 years with a man by the name of Will Alexander, who retired, I think, 3 or 4 times, always coming back and working. And when he was 94, he asked me, he said, "Carla, are we done yet?" And he knew that I would always say no. So he was dying, and there are people in this room that came to his bedside right as he was slipping away. I was one of them who was sitting there, and he asked that we would all just let him die. He did not want any extra treatment. He just wanted to go peacefully, and he was doing that. I think would have been just hours, he would have passed away in his sleep and would not have known anything other than a peaceful conclusion. I don't want to say all the details that happened next because it would implicate people that don't need to be implicated. But suffice it to say, he ended up in the hospital again with extra care and became very frustrated in that, although he was one partially deciding for that based on some other things that happened. And the last day of his life in the hospital was spent asking to be discharged without any other questions. AMA, 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 AMA is all he said, the only thing he said on the last day of his hospitalization. So, what caused him to want to work and retire and then come back and then come back and then come back again? Was it that he thought his work was not finished? No, because he knew that I was carrying it on. Was it that he had loved ones that were still in existence or that he felt responsible for? His wife had died just the year before. What was it? I think what it was for Will was what it is for many in a Seventh-day Adventist faith, given some theological understandings, is just an absolute joy of living. Being so deeply connected to the people around oneself that one doesn't want to leave them, that one wants to continue developing memories as the historical aspect of what living on this earth means. So with that, I want to say that it may be that a positive expectation about the future does not necessitate an eagerness or a willingness for a foreshortened present. So I want to say that one more time. A positive perspective on an event in the future does not necessitate an eagerness or a willingness for a foreshortened present. So it could be that people for whom one's body is so important and one's lifestyle is so important, that living a meaningful and an impactful life is so joyful and so tied up with religion, maybe those people just don't want to leave it, even though they want to join the next phase. A good example of that might be probably all of us would raise our hands that we look forward to retirement. But a lot of hands would go down if you asked, do you want to start it tomorrow?
First of all, thank you, Dr. Macauley, for your thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. I'm honored to be a part of this esteemed panel of academics and healthcare giants. And in full disclosure, I am neither of those. I am simply a dad who loved and lost his son, and I take advantage of every opportunity I can to share his story. It's rarely a good thing when you walk into a family conference room and there are 15 healthcare directors at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital sitting around the table. But that's what my wife and I walked into on the 6th day of our son Joey's life. On the 4th day, during a routine exam, They noticed that Joey wasn't responding to stimuli as they expected, so they decided to run some tests, including an MRI. As you can probably guess, the results did not come back favorable. Joey had suffered an HIE, hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. What they predicted was about 12 to 24 hours prior to his delivery. The injury was so extensive that it went all the way to his brain stem. So after the initial period of shock, the first question that my wife and I asked was, what are our treatment options? The chief neonatologist looked at us, dead in the eye, and said, none. The only decision you need to make is you let us know when you're ready to let him go. I'm embarrassed to admit that at that moment I did not possess the faith of Abraham. I did not bind our son and raise my knife to the heavens. Rather than placing our son in God's hands, we took matters into our own hands. We called in every favor that we could. We called in every connection that we had. We sent the scans to Boston Children's. We sent the scan to Johns Hopkins. We sent the scans to Stanford. We researched alternative treatment options, stem cell research. But when the medical experts and alternative treatment options came back empty, then we turned to God. There's an old saying that the only time people ever look up to God is when they're lying flat on their backs. We were on our backs at that moment. We called upon the church for a season of prayer. We asked our pastor to come and lay hands on Joey. We claimed God's promises and pleaded for a miracle, all in the name of Jesus. We went back to our pediatric neurologist, and fully expecting a miracle, we asked for a second MRI. We knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that with our faith, combined with the efforts of our faith community, God would be able to perform a miracle. But then something strange happened. Our neurologist said absolutely not. But we pleaded. We want to allow room for God's miracles to be manifest. And then she said something to us that I'll never forget. She looked at my wife and I and said, you need to realize how sick your little boy is. At that time, he was only a week old. He was already exhibiting early signs of CP. She said, I'm begging you to give up hope in your son and focus on taking care of each other. The miracle that you're hoping for will happen, but it will not happen in the way you anticipated it. The miracle that you're hoping for will happen, just not in the way you anticipated it. You talk about spiritual care in that moment. Wow. That conversion was the pivotal moment in our journey, and it changed our mindset from what could be to what is. You see, hope in these situations can be a dangerous thing. And sometimes the absence of hope is what sets us free. On the 12th day, we built up the courage to let our son go. We were scared and deathly afraid. We could not picture our life beyond Joey's death. They led us into a small, dark room. They carefully removed Joey's monitors and finally his breathing tube. And for those few moments, it was just the three of us. We were not sure what to do as we waited for Joey to pass away, so we sang hymns. And I'm sure a lot of us or all of us have heard about the peace that passes all understanding. But as my wife and I literally held our son in our arms as he died, all we could feel was the unmistakable presence of God. God had performed a miracle that day, just not in the way we anticipated. So some of you are going to ask, what is the role of the religious community through our journey? As we made the decision to say goodbye, UCSF cleared out an entire bay of the NICU, and they allowed our family to have a baby dedication right there in the unit. our pastor, 75 church and family members attended little Joey's dedication. On the day that Joey died, our pastor showed up at 6 a.m. He sat right outside the door for 8 hours, and he said, "I'm here if you need, and I'm praying constantly." There are intangibles that a faith community provides that cannot be replicated. But in the end, a concerted effort between our healthcare and faith community was the greatest blessing to us. There's not a day that goes by that we don't miss Joey. We don't wish that he was here with us. We're so grateful for the care that we receive from our medical and faith teams. But most of all, we are grateful for the true hope, for the true assurance that one day God will resurrect, God will reunite, and God will restore.
So I'd like to thank my fellow panelists for sharing what they had to share. Mark, it's the first time I'd heard that story in all that detail. Thank you. And Dr. Macauley, thank you for your presentation. And also, whether you knew it or not, I was looking through your slides earlier this week, and it helped me, I think, select the textbook for one of my classes, the Balboni.
Oh, I thought you were talking about mine.
Oh, no. Well, so I wasn't, I was the Balboni. And if my students end up liking it, I'll take credit. And if they don't, I'll say it was Dr. Macaulay's recommendation. But thank you for your analysis and for the way you've really just shown in a very vivid way how what people believe shapes what they do, and the decisions they make. I'd like to just maybe flush out a little bit of the relevant philosophical and theological considerations you've brought to our attention. That may be another kind of additional layer to the phenomena that you're drawing our attention to. So I'd like to start off with some Miroslav Volf. He's a theologian at Yale, and he's got a wonderful book called Flourishing, where at the end of the book, he reflects on his pen, actually. And the way he describes it, it's a gold-nibbed pelican fountain pen. And he explains that to him, as fine of a writing instrument as it is more than a material object. When he feels it between his fingers, he writes, "I don't just touch on an object. I relate to my Father, who gave it to me." So he goes on to argue that things are not just things, but rather they are the locus of social relations, especially when those things are gifts. And that's what makes the perfect gift so perfect, right? Sure, there's the pleasure of using it, but what accentuates and maybe heightens the pleasure is the reminder of the thoughtfulness and the care of the giver. And so for me, I have an old pair of sneakers in my closet, ones I don't wear that much anymore, but because they were gifted to me by my wife, who on an international trip took the time to pick them out and bring them to me. I don't want to get rid of them, right? So this is what Volf notes. Attachment to God amplifies and deepens enjoyment of the world. And so I think you can see where I'm going to go with this. Life, I would suggest, for many religious believers is experienced as that, and you've referenced this. People believe it to be a gift, but I would add, not just believe, they experience it as a gift from God. And so beyond the belief that life is sacred, there's this fundamental sense, this daily experience that the world in which I exist, the people in it, the things that I enjoy are God's gift to me. And so I would suggest, if this is correct, another reason perhaps religious believers, particularly if they're Christians, might be reluctant to part with life, is that we are reluctant to part with gifts. There is a genuine fear of permanent loss. Now, the other theological kind of consideration, this fear of death as permanent loss is compounded, I would argue, by the ambiguous and often conflicting notions many Christians have about the afterlife. And this is what Dr. Gober has just mentioned, the concept of heaven. And this is due to the texts in the Bible, as we have seen on your slides, that seem to say two quite different things. One is that the afterlife is some sort of disembodied state, and the other is that it's somehow ultimately a new kind of life to be enjoyed in a resurrected body. So belief it is the former leads to the sense that at death, this body, this world, and the other bodies that I am in relation with, as imperfect as they are, they are gifts of God, and they will be lost forever. Heaven, as blissful as it is, still won't be the life I enjoy it to be as now, or some semblance, or some version of it. So I believe that some prayers pray a version of the prayer that Augustine is said to have prayed before his conversion: "Give me chastity and continency, only not yet." Right? But is heaven a permanent disembodiment? Heaven as permanent disembodiment, is that what Christianity teaches? I think many Christians would be surprised to learn that it is not. Although there is disagreement about what happens immediately after death, sleep or some sort of conscious, semi-conscious state, eventually Christian orthodoxy affirms that there will be a reunion with the body at the resurrection. I won't string through a whole bunch of texts or string a bunch of texts together. I'll quote the Apostles' Creed. I believe in the resurrection of the body and life everlasting. And so furthermore, if we do look to the Bible, we find in the closing chapters a vision of a heaven come to earth and God making all things new on earth to be enjoyed in bodies. So I share Dr. Macaulay's concerns about better end-of-life care consultation. I believe that it should be done jointly by medical and spiritual communities working together. And I think there should be better bioethical and biomedical training for clergy, too. I think that's really, really important. But in light of these brief reflections here, I think there's plenty of room for better theological education for both religious and medical communities and professionals. Thank you.
So thank you all very much for those incredibly thoughtful comments. It's always interesting. It feels to me like you guys didn't really disagree with me very much. I don't really disagree with you very much. So I appreciate the opportunity to explore what we can do about this. And especially with Mark's comments, it reminded me. So I'm a pediatric palliative care doc, and there have been so many times when a family has said to me, "Man, your job is hard." And I would say, there's one job that's a whole lot harder than mine. So thank you for sharing that story about Joey. And I'd love to hear what you guys think.
Okay, well, we do have a few minutes, and in case, do we still have the Nerf ball microphones? And some of you want to use those. For those of you who are too timid to use those but have the best questions we haven't heard yet, let me give you another alternative. Here's a number. Can you read it? If you text that number with your comment or question, I'll get it, and I'll try to make it available to our speakers. So can you see the number? Yeah. Okay. So use that if you like, but we also have people who would like to use the microphone. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much for these presentations. As one who comes from Oregon, also in Eugene, a community that's not particularly faith-based or strong in religion, as a family physician, now a 50-year graduate of this school, I see a lot of cancer patients and see them going downhill, getting into the oncologist and the radiation people. But many of them become angry near the end of their life. And I don't know if it's just the medications they're given or just their religious background coming out, but how do we minister to them when we really want to help them spiritually and find them distancing themselves, becoming more angry and not wanting the care that, as a Christian physician, we could certainly provide?
Thank you very much for your question. I think that it's hard when you have a long-standing relationship with a patient and then they get involved in sort of specialist care, and that's where they get all their care. And I can imagine sort of it's a sense of losing touch and trying to figure out how you can help this person that you care so much about. I think there are a couple of things that come to mind. One is emotions are hard. Anger is a particularly hard emotion. And oftentimes I think that in the medical world, emotions are off-putting, and we're sort of like, oh, I don't want to go there. That's a little too hot to handle. And in palliative care, we always go where the emotion is. So if someone's angry, there's a reason that they're angry. And I think simply inquiring about that and just asking them, where does their faith come into play? And honoring faith, if that's something that they feel. And even if it's not something that they can explicitly identify, just pulling back a little bit. Because sometimes, as you all know, when the train leaves the station, it gets a lot of momentum. And it's hard to stop it in terms of different treatments and different goals and expectations and assumptions. And one of the things that we try to do on our team a lot is step back and say, let's take the foot off the accelerator and ask ourselves, where are you at in all this? And is this matching up with your hopes and fears? And trying to sort of go more specifically towards them and their feelings as opposed to the treatment plan that they have.
I see.
I would suggest, having grown up in the conservative Midwest, that in many cases, not doing everything you can to preserve life is the same as suicide, or thought to be suicide, which is breaking the commandment, thou shalt not kill. I think that's in a lot of people's minds.
I don't know if, some of these comments may not be questions. They may just be comments, if anybody wants to respond to that. Let me read a question that did come in, and I don't know what to make of this question. How does the prosperity gospel affect decisions on end of life? I'm not sure I know for sure what the prosperity gospel is. I think it's the thing you see on television, where if you believe this person, you'll get rich. Is that basically the notion? Something like that. So I don't know if anybody has a comment on that, but that's a question that came in. All right, have a go, Dr. Yee.
Well, I don't know if it addresses maybe generally the understanding of the gospel. One thing I was thinking about, Dr. Macauley, as you were presenting, was those cases where loving family members think, oh, my father or mother didn't have a chance to say the sinner's prayer, right? And so they didn't live a converted life. So if we could just have them come back and just say those words, right? There could be this deathbed conversion that would then ensure their eternal state. I wondered if that kind of understanding of the gospel would be a relevant factor in some cases.
Yeah, I think it totally would be, especially when it's someone else making decisions for you. But going back to the original question, I think the prosperity gospel has a huge bearing on this, because when people say the prosperity gospel, they're usually talking about monetary prosperity. But if you think about it, to prosper, one would hope that has to do with something in addition to money. And that kind of comes back to that transactional view of prayer that I was mentioning earlier. Like, if the prosperity gospel is, I do this stuff and then God gives me what I want, if I'm dealing with cancer, there's probably something I want more than money. And I think that actually plays into it quite a bit.
Sometimes wonder if a related question here in the blue zone. You all know what a blue zone is? Pretty much everybody here does. It's a little bit of a quid pro quo like that, in that if you eat the right things and get your exercise, you have the guarantee of a long life. And I've sometimes wondered if it affects the decision making at the end of life, because it's sort of like letting down the team, right? You're gonna foul up the statistics. And so I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that, but that thought has crossed my mind. Yes, right there.
Sure. This may be a difference between a community hospital and a university hospital, but I find a lot of patients that really are end of life don't trust somebody they don't know. And so they come into hospitalists and to services and to chaplains that they don't know, and really to take advice and to take that, they don't trust that. And so they don't always walk with whatever that suggestion is. If the treating physician who is contacted, who has a relationship with that patient and is able to look at that situation, walks into the room and says, I know this is a situation, this is a temptation, but it really isn't going to go anywhere. And in the process, etc. Explain it in those terms, many times that's all it takes. And they now know that a person that's been with them for months, years or whatever, can give them an advice. It's somebody they know and trusted all that time. that could be important. So I think it'd be very important to make sure the entire team is working on this and not just the most recent treating physicians.
I take it from one of Dr. Macaulay's earlier comments that he's probably likely to agree with that. You know, all right, right there, Donna.
This is a combination, I guess, of a question and a comment. I think there are levels of uncertainty in all of these areas. There's levels of uncertainty, as Carl has already mentioned, about the nature of the afterlife, whether it's coming at all, and whether what it will be if there is one. There are levels of uncertainty in trust, as this gentleman has just said. I had a friend, whom some of you know well, who was an ethicist, and who refused to sign an advance directive. This was a person who was well acquainted with the medical system. His brother was a surgeon, and he was someone who was well educated, had a PhD from Harvard nearby. And he said, no, I don't, and he had been here for a long time, knew many of the physicians. He said, I don't want anybody to make that decision before I get to that point. And even then, I love life so much that I want everything possible done, even if I'm only half as smart as I was. If you can bring me back, that'll be good enough, you know. So I don't think it's always either simple theology or lack of information or any of those things that make people make different kinds of decisions, and that those levels of uncertainty in those areas are different among different people. And sometimes I wonder if acceding to a request for more care for a while is in fact the more Christian and beneficial thing to do.
Anyone here want to respond to that?
So I totally agree. I think that the complexity that you note is really important to recognize. And I didn't in any way want to say that our job from a spiritual perspective is to talk anybody out of anything. It is more, like there's an old saying in spiritual care, even if a certain coping mechanism is a crutch, you don't take it away from somebody before you give them something better, or else they're going to fall over. And a lot of my work in palliative care is to build that trust that isn't there at the beginning because I'm getting to know somebody. So if they say, I want everything, I'm like, no, that's a bad idea. That's not working out so well. Like you sort of have to walk down the path that they're walking until they know that you're their companion. And then while you're walking that road, maybe you can have a conversation.
While we're getting ready for the next comment, let me just read this one that was texted. Even in hospice care, these issues are often present. It's not a wholesale letting go, as might have been implied in what we've heard so far. Any comment on that? I mean, I've watched patients in hospice care who probably struggle with the same kind of, and it seems to me that sometimes the system struggles with that because there may be things that are needed in hospice care to alleviate pain or whatever, another procedure, but that may not be allowed by the rules of hospice care. Have you run into that kind of concern? Yeah, Carla.
When you mentioned the system, I wanted to comment. There's a Netflix documentary comparing Intermountain Healthcare with another healthcare system, showing how, and this goes back to the comment on trust, showing how the cost in terms of end of life actually are lower with their healthcare system as a whole, because they're building this trust and a whole team approach to getting people the best kind of information. So I was curious about how various health systems might compare with each other, and those who are more prepared in talking with people, and those who either aren't as prepared or actually may want the care to extend into higher costs. So.
Okay. I see, all right there, yes, with the orange one.
I very much appreciated the complexity of the religious community's response to end of life, both positive and negative, because I've I'm a 30-year now graduate of this institution, and 15 of my years have been, I'm an anesthesiologist trained at University of Vermont, so it's nice to see a fellow Catamount. Practiced in northern New England, primarily in Maine, for the vast majority of my career, with about a 4-year locum period out in the Northwest, just north of you in Washington State, right over the state line in Walla Walla. So I've practiced for a number of years around high-intensity medicine that's associated with death, cardiac anesthesia. People are at end-of-life thought processes when they're walking and rolling into the cardiac ORs. And I've been troubled with short terms at 3 different retirement communities of high faith, one in Fletcher, North Carolina, one in Brunswick, Maine, and one in Walla Walla, Washington, where my services were more generic rather than cardiac anesthesia, where I noticed that my community of faith seemed to struggle with trust, though our religious language is a high trust quality. Yet as they were rolling through the doors, the amount of anesthetic required to get them to shut up and slow down and lie still was comparable to those that were acutely addicted. And I have been deeply troubled by that for much of my career, trying to come to terms, why is it that the religion makes us idiots when it comes to needing help from others, and unable to receive, unable to trust at the most foundational level? And, that's not a carte blanche characterization. There are quantities, like Carla pointed out with our common respected elder, Will Alexander, where trust is paramount. It's huge. And I've seen sterling examples of that. But there's a significant percentage of us that cannot let go and just let somebody else be with us. And so I've wondered about it in my own sort of professional and psycho-spiritual journey, if there's something about religion that's an addiction, much like the active addict who has not reached sobriety yet. Because I think within the 12-step community, there's a power, that's first step of powerlessness, that ability to turn things over to somebody else. There's something about religion where we're addicted to locus of control. We're addicted to being right. And how do you ever sober up from being addicted to being right? And I think there's a whole nother discussion. But, are there fear of the addiction to drugs, fear of loss of control, fear of partial success at the end of life kind of conversations, which implies partial failure, which in an end of life kind of thing must mean complete eternal loss rather than win. And so there's huge, sort of gradation there. And in processing this, how do I deal with this in the short, sweet? That's what I love about anesthesia. Relationships are very short, and there's no dishonesty. Just 5-minute conversations. And I've begun to adopt practicing again. And the second most, Portland's the most atheistic. Well, Portland, Maine is the second most. And I'm just a few miles north of there now in my present community practice. And I've changed my consent language. After I do a thorough review of systems, and I go through and their eyes get big because anesthesia is so foreign and it's so frightening. I said, you may wonder and you may be afraid while we're going through this. I said, the reason is I'm becoming you. Because I've learned your values and I've learned your story, and I'm going to live your story where you're in a place where you can no longer live it for yourself. And I believe that that's an entirely spiritual concept of a savior who comes and adopts my struggle. And I've wondered if, as a healthcare provider in these end-of-life things, because it takes me back to, my earlier career where I was a director of the OR actually at Eastern Maine Medical Center in Bangor for a while on the heart team there. And I was just, only half of our cardiac guys would take care of Jehovah's Witnesses because ethically we didn't believe in their belief system, and so they wouldn't. Well, I don't share that belief structure, but I believe my duty is to nurture somebody in their present state and carry them through a dark place if they don't have the talent or the skill that I have.
Mm-hmm.
So I was one of two.
Let me jump in right there because we are actually out of time. Let me give a brief opportunity at least, because there's a lot there that you just said, for a response.
I think I was especially struck by your comment about the amount of anesthetic needs among faithful people. Part of me is like, everybody has a right to be scared. And it also reminded me, in terms of your notice, a mention of control. There are a lot of definitions of sin out there. The one that I often use is not letting God be God, which is sort of like another way of saying the first commandment. And we all struggle with control. Even the most faithful among us, I think, struggles with control. And so kind of comes back to an earlier comment, it's not all or nothing. You're not either totally faithful or you're not at all. Like, we're all muddling our way through the sinner's journey. And the opportunity to show compassion to somebody who's struggling at that critical moment, I think, is a gracious possibility.
We're going to need to keep faith with the rest of the program.
Our time actually goes till 12:15.
Oh, it does?
If you want to take that time, yes.
Oh, well, we're going to lose part of our audience here, but Paul, I've seen you holding that for a long time, and I do have a couple more texts here that I'd like to read.
Yes, a couple of a quick observation, and that is that I've run into, particularly among the black community, the concern that they're going to be not really treated appropriately. Memories of Tuskegee come back to mind, sometimes explicitly. And I think that the trust issue is huge. And I would like to suggest that, among all the other solutions that there are, maybe the one that the person for whom this lecture series is named might be a good example. Jack Provencio was a minister who became a physician. He was actually in my dad's class. His daughter was in my class, so there's a certain amount of connection there. And rather than expecting the clergy to figure this out, maybe we need to be more spiritually aware. I noticed that you have you've become a Episcopal priest, is that right? And so, I think that that's part of the answer, is that doctors are going to have to actually participate in this kind of thing, and that means a little more training than what you would normally get. The other thing I'd like to emphasize is that we don't know as much as we think we did. My dad was a surgeon. He had a stroke. He had his wits about him. He was very firm that he did not want CPR, signed whatever papers needed to be signed, or more precisely, X'd them while I and some of his other relatives witnessed and signed for him. But knowing him for a long time, he was an emergency physician as well, and so he knew what he was doing. Then one day his pulse went down to 20 while he was in the shower, and he collapsed on the floor, and the person who was taking care of him, who was an ICU nurse, did CPR on him. He was forever grateful after that. I used to think I knew that people knew what they were choosing. I no longer think so.
Okay. Any response to that? I think we probably have all seen cases where people change their minds when the conditions change. Let me read this one, and thank you, Paul, because there are a couple like this. My experience suggests that much of the desire for life-prolonging views are based on cultural and political feelings rather than a spiritual grounding. And there's another one along that line, how much culture matters, and I suspect that the early part of Paul's comment goes to that. Well, there are people in our culture who have probably plenty of reasons to be distrustful. And it wouldn't surprise us if they brought that lack of trust to the clinical setting. I don't know what more we can say about it other than maybe extra efforts to rebuild trust. Any other comments on that? No? Okay. There's still time. Yeah, we will take one or two more.
Yes.
I have a short comment and would like to ask a question.
Oh, all right. Green,
Okay.
then orange. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
In '68, I was in Vietnam, and since I'm a member of the military, we're not supposed to proselytize. So this GI comes in with a gunshot wound in his right upper chest, blood squirting in and out, and he's not going to live long. And the thief on the cross is supposed to be in heaven. God takes care of the situation. Do I have an obligation to proselytize this man and say, how is your relationship with God? because he's dead in 10 to 15 minutes. Do I give him the opportunity to ask God to clear up his situation? What would you do, is the question.
Well, we have a panel of 4 theologians here, moderated by a 5th one. I'll try to keep them moderate, but let's see if anybody wants to answer that. No, they don't. Okay. They're thinking.
I'll take one.
Okay, Carla.
There's so many important things to God, and one of them certainly is personal choice. So I think my first inclination is to say, I think it all depends on whether that, where's the questioner?
Right there.
Whether that man wants to have that conversation.
I don't know. I'm there, he's laying there communicating a bit. Am I supposed to ask him? Am I supposed to reach out to him and say, are you related to God in the
No,
way
but,
you want to be?
but why not ask him if he wants to have a conversation?
Well, we're busy trying to stop the bleeding. He's dying.
All right, that's as much of an answer as we were going to get. I think. Oh, there's Dr. Macauley.
I can imagine, I can only imagine what that scene that you described would be like, given the fact that, it's not in isolation. It's not like, he's your only patient and you're not going to have another patient for a while. I'm sure there's all kinds of stuff going on. Also, I think that the probability of someone in that situation, if he's bleeding out and he's got 10 minutes to live, the possibility of having a thoughtful conversation is extremely low. I also think that your presence with him
Yes.
and caring for him
Yes.
and upholding him in prayer in that moment, there's only so much we can do. Like we've already talked about control several times. I think you can be the presence of God in his life at the end. And that, given the circumstances, might be all that you can do. And I think that's actually quite a lot.
Yeah. Yes.
I think I want to add one thought in that it would seem like an odd view of the Creator to me if his eternal destiny depended on the good or bad luck of being able to have that conversation.
Yes.
That seems very capricious to me. All right, with the orange one.
Yes, your category of redemptive suffering reminded me of an old Jack Benny joke. He was Jewish, and he said that Jewish people don't drink much because it interferes with their suffering. But I was thinking that one other reason that people of faith may hold on is because there's something they might want to say to somebody. There's some family member or close friend or something that they've got unfinished business with. And I'd like to leave you with one Bible text that might help some people of faith. It's Psalms 116, verse 15. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints.
Okay, all right. I want to make sure before I see Paul that I've given everybody else who hasn't had a chance. All right, one short one maybe, Paul, right there.
One observation can be made, and that was that Jesus didn't go hunting after the thief on the cross. The thief on the cross told his fellow thief, "Shut up, we belong here." He doesn't. And then asked Jesus, will you remember me when you come into your kingdom? And then Jesus responded. A lot of people think that they can just walk in and say the magic words and somebody else will say, "Oh yeah, I never thought of that. Listen, let me just confess Jesus as my Lord and Savior." The thief on the cross walked into Jesus' hands. And I think that to answer that question, if somebody says, now that I'm dying, what do I need to do? Or what, then you have a whole different situation than if you walk to everybody, you're dying now. Have you made your life right with God?
Okay, thank you. I'm not seeing any other hands. We'll have I'm wrong. There's one. All right. Last one.
I just wanted to address what was the question here that was asked at end of life. I had a patient that was had serious trauma, multiple trauma. Her husband had died already, and she was real sick, and they were working on her. We were working on her, and she began to slip. And what was interesting is that, and everybody was working as hard as they possibly could to save her. She was like 80 years old, so she was not real young. And then one of the nurses just boldly, she said, "Dr. Biemeister, why don't you pray here for us?" So we all prayed around her table there. She was dying. And I think what it really struck me, that, I mean, she trusted me that I would be able to say something that would be meaningful in prayer. But I think what it did is it bonded us all together as caregivers, and realizing there's a sanctity in life, but there's also a sanctity as a person is passing on, is dying. And you know, we've talked about that multiple times since that happened. And we always speak of it in a very sacred way, you know, because we had this opportunity in ministering to her. We don't know if she was alert enough to even hear it or not, but it did a lot to us. So.
I've often had that same thought, that we who work in this setting do enter into the most sacred moments of people's lives, often not sure exactly what to do. The reason I wanted to stop now, and even though we have just a couple more minutes, is to give each of the panelists a chance to say anything else in the final word to you, Dr. Macauley. So you don't have to, but if you have anything, any final sentence or two. Carla?
I thoroughly enjoyed this discussion, and I think you're on to something, actually. I think you're on to something in this discussion that could actually say something to religious people and encourage them to ask questions about what their theology is and how it's working. I think that part's actually quite exciting. The second thing, I think religious communities could think more deeply about their role in what's happening. And the part that I didn't talk about with Will was it was the religious community that came in and wanted him to live longer than he actually had decided to live in the end, because we couldn't let him go. So you're onto some things, and I hope you unpack those. If for no one else, the religious communities. I think there's something for us to learn in that. Yeah.
Mark, if you want.
I think what I would say to all of you as healthcare professionals is thank you. Thank you for the work that you do. Never take a day for granted that the work that you do is sacred work. And it's work that has care that has allowed my wife and I to heal because of the treatment that we got, because of the love that we received from you as healthcare providers. We were able to internalize our pain and deal with it, as opposed to externalize our anger or frustration with with the lack of love or care that we received. So never take the work that you do for granted, and thank you for blessing our lives.
I guess the final question I was thinking about, as the questions are going back and forth, I was thinking about a study that I talk about with some of my students of how doctors want to die as a study. And it seems like if the spiritual community errs on the side of wanting to prolong, you know, from a non-medical perspective, medical doctors, the care they want, it seems like, is really Spartan, you know. And I wonder if there's room for kind of a pushback, and sometimes if the medical community is, if the spiritual community is excessive in wanting too much care, if there's room for a healthy dialogue, a push and tug on, you know, maybe, and I know you're not arguing this, that, yeah, just the pure efficient route is not the only value consideration. So I'm kind of thinking through that. I'd love to hear any thoughts you might have on that.
No, I agree with you. I think that, you know, it kind of highlights so much of what we've been talking about getting people talking to each other and sharing our mutual perspectives. You know, my sort of personal anecdote was, so I did a combined medical school, divinity school program. So I did them together. And it was very interesting. The medical folks, the primary response they had to the fact that I was doing divinity school as well was distrust, that, you know, maybe I wasn't dedicated to science enough or something like that. And the primary responses that I got from the divinity community was initially curiosity, like, well, that's interesting. And subsequently, as I sought to engage the divinity school community in more substantive conversations, was one of relative disinterest. There were a group of us who said, you know, you guys aren't really, after the fact, you guys aren't really training the people coming out of your school to be prepared to do really good spiritual care in a medical context. Maybe you need to educate the students there, in addition to systematic theology, to what do you do when one of your parishioners is dying? And there was lip service paid to that because it didn't fit neatly into anything that they were talking about. So I think that part of it is just recognizing that we need each other and then putting people in a context where we can share our gifts with each other.
One final chance to thank Dr. Robert Macauley, physician, philosopher, theologian, and our panel.